Bitcoin is currently on the rise. The head of the US Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, dropped a major interest rate bombshell at the Fed meeting. Yesterday, he suggests that there will be a risk-on switch now. This means that we might now have a potential last chance to buy Bitcoin at a good price before the Federal Reserve influences the party with massive stimulus and pumps all asset prices up. This means that in the best case, we can expect to see an emergency meeting in May where the Fed will announce a stimulus. In the worst case, it will probably stretch out to October. We now have a short window to buy Bitcoin at a good price. Bitcoin simply correlates with global liquidity cycle. The Fed is setting the stage here. And now we have hints that we'll be stimulated again and that we're shifting from a risk-off setting to a risk-on setting. The institution responsible for us shifting into a risk-on sentiment, while right now we're in a risk-off mode, is the Federal Reserve. And now we're going to take a close look at what went down at the Fed meeting, because yesterday was the Fed meeting and the interest rates remained unchanged. But that wasn't the interesting part of the meeting. The interesting part was the Q&A session afterward. The interesting part was the FOMC statements that were released, indicating the end of QT. And then there was another major bombshell. And Jerome Powell has directly taken on Donald Trump here. He made a statement that Donald Trump isn't really going to like in that style. And Donald Trump has repeatedly clashed with Jerome Powell. Donald Trump said, hey, Jerome Powell needs to lower the interest rates. And what does he do? Then there was back and forth, heated debates, but Jerome Powell has always said, no, I don't care what Donald Trump says. I'm independent here. Donald Trump has repeatedly hinted that he doesn't think Jerome Powell is doing a good job. We'll take a look at that too. Party is saying here about the Fed meeting that the US Central Bank is now announcing that we're in stagflation mode. So stagflation can be explained pretty easily here. See, that means unemployment is going up, inflation is going up, and economic growth is going down. And this is the stagflation mode, which is actually here. It would be announced in the meeting. So they often talked about uncertainty, that there's a lot of uncertainty with the economy about how all this stuff is going to play out. They later touched on the sell, and we'll get into that shortly because it's really interesting in the whole Donald Trump and Jerome Powell story. We have, for example, Party Moss here who says, hey, Powell is telling us that QT is coming to an end. The dam is going to break. So people are already ultra bullish. The dam is definitely going to break. We're going to go into risk-on mode. We're going to take a close look at when the dam is going to break here. And specifically, we see here in the FOMC statements, QT ends on the 1st April. That means quantitative tightening. You have to understand that now. So quantitative tightening means that money isn't being put into circulation like it is with QE, but rather that money is being pulled out of the party. And when you start to scale back the QT stuff, it means you're pulling less and less money out of the party, until eventually no money is pulled out at all. And that means we're now on the brink of QE. So the question is whether it's going to be a massive shift into QE or if we're just going to stay neutral for now. But in any case, the announcement here is no more QT. And the party sees this as very bullish. We also saw right after the Fed meeting that the Bitcoin price went up initially because Bitcoin is very fragile in relation to global liquidity. And we definitely see, hey, let's fucking go. So the stimulus has been announced here. And I've already told you that at the beginning. This could really be the last chance to take advantage of this dip, to benefit from the risk-off sentiment, and to buy Bitcoin at a good price. This is not financial advice. You make your own decisions. But that's just what you can take away from the meeting. And now let's go through it point by point, what was all announced in the meeting. So first off here, the interest rates remain here at 4.25% to 4.5%. So nothing has changed at all. But it was already clear beforehand that the interest rates would neither be raised nor lowered. And now we have 6 key points that are being announced here. First, the Fed is keeping the interest rates unchanged for the second time in a row, just at the same level. That means we now have 2 consecutive central bank meetings where the interest rate hasn't changed. And now the big question is, okay, is the next interest rate hike coming in May? We'll get into that shortly or maybe later. I said that by October at the latest, it could really blow up in the best case, but possibly even in May. Then we have here, the Fed says that the uncertainty regarding the economy has increased. So that's what I said before. I watched the Fed meeting, and they often talk about uncertainty. I think someone even counted that it was the most used word in the meeting. So it was a lot about uncertainty. Then we have here, the average forecast indicates a rate cut of 50 basis points in 2025. So if you take all the Fed officers together, all the big shots at the Fed, then you put them all together. Some say, okay, let's go with 3, some say 2, some say 1 or something like that. When you put it all together, you have an average forecast of a 50 basis point cut in 2025. I don't think that's a whole lot yet. That would mean you either have an emergency meeting with a 50 basis point cut and then nothing more, or you have 2 rate cuts of 25 basis points, so 2 by 0.25 basis points, which is more likely. I released the video yesterday where Katie would says, hey, she even expects that we'll have 3 rate cuts and that we could already reach a lower interest rate level this year. She also expects that there could definitely be more than 3 rate cuts. So we have different views on that. And then here comes the most important point. Fed slows balance sheet. Reduction AB, that's going to be a really, really important date. On the 2nd, in April, the reciprocal tariffs will come into effect. So I already told you, and that was, 3 days ago, I made a video about the 2nd. April, you really need to pay close attention to that date because a lot could change. And now we have the next hint that a lot could change on this date, because that's when the balance sheet reduction starts. I mean, it won't happen on the 1st. In April, Bitcoin might somehow escalate upwards, or something like that. But from then on, we'll kind of slowly drift into a risk-on sentiment. That's the most likely situation. I mean, there can always be other weird events, like a war breaking out. Now, a global economic crisis or whatever could completely throw everything into chaos. And then it could even be that even though we see interest rate cuts, simply because we are now in total emergency mode, everyone will panic and we will still sell off. So what I'm telling you now is that this scenario could be the last chance to buy Bitcoin at a good price before we switch into risk-on mode. That's just on the condition that we don't see any black swan events, that we don't see a war breaking out again, that we don't see a global economic crash or something like that, some really crazy event, the aliens attack, or something like that, but rather that we just continue on a normal course here. Then we have the next point that would be communicated. The Fed significantly lowers growth forecasts for 2025. That's also a good indicator that shows, hey, if growth forecasts decline, then we need to stimulate the economy. Because the Fed, yes, actually its only goal is price stability, but they're now interfering in the economy. And if the economy isn't good enough, then sooner or later they have to lower interest rates, especially if inflation is somewhat under control. And here's the next point that's really crucial. Inflation was now even partially declining. Now it says here in the 6th point, the Fed is raising its inflation forecast for 2025. That means we're above the inflation forecast, which isn't necessarily ultra bullish, because it would actually be more bullish if inflation was low. Because if inflation is low, then the Fed can do more to tighten the belt. Then the Fed can stimulate more. But now we see the inflation forecast for 2025 slightly raised, which doesn't necessarily have to be all that bad. And then it's really, really interesting to see how the party assesses this here. Expectations for an interest rate cut are dropping again. At the beginning of this week, the prediction markets were looking at a baseline scenario of 3 interest rate cuts in 2025. Now the baseline scenario is dropping drastically, and the average forecast is only 2.6 cuts for this year. The likelihood of an interest rate cut before June 2025 is now back under 20%. So that's actually not so bullish. Katie would predict, but actually more negatively, because the party assesses that there will be fewer interest rate cuts coming. But still, we have here the announcement of QT, the bullish sentiment, or not exactly the bullish sentiment, but the bullish statement that the party is really picking up on. The stories haven't turned out as well as some people here assumed. And now we really have to get into the Donald Trump and Jerome Powell story, because it actually says here, and this is very, very important, here Jerome Hedge posts this, the Fed staff forecasts are for full tariff retaliation. And it's very, very important to understand what this means, what Jerome Hedge is tweeting here. It says here that the Fed expects trade conflicts could escalate with full retaliatory tariffs, which could have potentially huge economic consequences, meaning that things could escalate even more. And yet, on one hand, you could say that the escalation leads to uncertainty in the party, and this uncertainty leads to the point that no capital flows into the party. On the other hand, you could also see it this way, that this uncertainty forces the Fed to implement some kind of stimulus. For sure, you already wrapped up with QT, but maybe it's time to start talking about QE. Then it transitions into stimulus, and when the stimulus comes, despite the uncertainty, it's very, very likely that the party will switch to a risk-on sentiment. Because when liquidity is pumped back into the party, and when central banks start buying government bonds and so on again, that's very, very bullish for Bitcoin. Historically, we also see that the parabolic price increase phase only happens when QE really kicks in. So it's not just when interest rates are lowered a bit, but when it's really full on with the money printer going. BRR. And now I'm going to play you a clip from the FOMC meeting. After that, there was a Q&A session. And now Jerome Powell is ranting about Donald Trump. I mean, he definitely tends to let loose a bit. He's trying to phrase everything diplomatically and all that, but you can still hear that he's not too amused about what Donald Trump is currently doing.
How much of it is tariff? So let me say that it is going to be very difficult to.
Es geht jetzt hier darum, wo die Inflation denn herkommt, und jetzt hört mal genau zu.
How much of it is tariff? So let me say that it is going to be very difficult to have a precise assessment of how much of inflation is coming from tariffs and from other, and that's already the case. You may have seen that goods inflation moved up pretty significantly in the first 2 months of the year. Trying to track that back to actual tariff increases, given what was tariffed and what was not, very, very challenging. So some of it, the answer is clearly some of it. A good part of it is coming from tariffs, but we'll be working, and so will other forecasters, to try to find the best possible way to separate non-tariff inflation from tariff inflation.
So this is probably not going to sit well with Donald Trump. What he's saying here, because he's getting into it now, and first of all, it's obviously tough to distinguish which part of the inflation is coming from the tariffs and which part isn't. You can't really distinguish it, then you say it's difficult and blah blah blah. And he's not so sure about it. And that was the first story of the history. Later he says, yeah, a good chunk of it, or something like that, that's how he put it. A good chunk of it is definitely coming from the tariffs. And Donald Trump always says, no, it's not inflationary and blah blah blah, there's no need to panic and so on. Jerome Powell also says it here, and it is quite obvious that the tariffs here are inflationary. I always say that I said that right at the beginning. Hey folks, I'm not a fan of the tariffs. This is definitely going to pump prices up. This is definitely going to be inflationary. Jerome Powell says it too. Donald Trump's goal is to unsettle the economy and bring down inflation, because then Jerome Powell will definitely lower the interest rates. But what could go wrong here is what Jerome Powell is saying, that maybe Donald Trump is unsettling the economy but pushing inflation up through the tariffs. Because if the economy is unsettled, but inflation is really high, then Jerome Powell won't either lower the interest rates or provide massive stimulus here. He will only do it if either the economy is very unsettled or if inflation goes down. And then he can stimulate here. And those are the current fire hazards that you need to keep an eye on. So what's next with Jerome Powell, Donald Trump, and all that? We definitely have the signal now. You guys need to mark April really big on your calendars. The party, well, nothing big is going to happen yet, but starting on the 1st. In April, we have the potential sentiment switch to risk on. And then it continues. Can we wait for that? Okay, either there's an emergency meeting coming up in my news hit, or depending on how things go. With all the inflation numbers and economic data by October, it should really be time for us to switch into a risk-on sentiment, and it would really fit perfectly. The cycles, feel free to let me know in the comments below how you see the whole thing. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'm putting a link down below for you. 21 Bitcoin, how you can easily, safely, and simply buy Bitcoin with the code BitcoinHotel. You can still get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin here. Make sure to check it out. Absolutely recommended. Guys, see you later. Peace out.